WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM. It is time out for CU Immigration. And I have to tell you that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, the Urbana Socialist Forum, or UPTV, which we like to say on the televised version of this show. Something like that. Anyway. Okay. I figured it out. It was my mistake. Sorry, I was about to blame the equipment, but it was me all along. Anyway, so yes, now we are back, and it's actually really hot in here. I would like for my charming guest to take this opportunity to introduce yourself, if you don't mind. And I'll play around with your volume while you're talking, and that's the way I figure this stuff out. So,
okay, sounds good. My name is Jo or Jocelyn. I graduated from U of I last year, and I've been working full time in high schools, helping students with college and financial aid. And I've been doing sort of activism on my own, and through UIUC, Ayuda, and Black Rose Rosa Negra Anarchist Federation.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome to the show. I'm going to try to now calm myself and become a professional host instead of someone who is trying to figure out why the equipment doesn't seem to be working. So pardon me if I don't do the transition well. Prior to the beginning of the show, we were talking about anarchism, and you were explaining it to me. One thing that came to mind is that like a political philosophy in the sense that, say, someone who says, well, I'm a communist, that might be a political philosophy, like you think the government should be a communist government as opposed to a capitalist government or whatever. Can you define something like anarchism as a political philosophy, given that it kind of rejects politics? Or is it a philosophy, or how do you see that?
Well, I'm also a communist, so.
Well, there you go. You got it.
Like I said, I didn't. I don't know a lot in terms in terms of like philosophical like arguments. Like for me, what I see, I guess what I've learned from the things that I've like read and heard is that anarchism isn't really is not as easily defined as something like I guess communism, which is also difficult to define, but in the sense that anarchism, like people have written down what anarchism is, but it's more so been an observation of the way certain societies have worked. So I think what's different with anarchism is that, at least for me, is, and I might be 100% wrong, but at least for me, is that it kind of observes what's already been going on, and like people who have been trying to like kind of like it's an observation of what's already been happening in communities, rather than, well, I guess so is communism, but it's more like it's not as easy to pin down because for me, I'm more interested in what it practically means when we're talking about like, and we're organizing in certain spaces, right? And somebody's trying to say, like, for example, against the detention center, right? And somebody says, well, we're going to argue that the detention center shouldn't be built in Dwight because it's not going to be the best economic situation for the residents of Dwight, right? And that's accurate. But as an anarchist, I would also say, well, why are we imprisoning people in the first place? Why is like state power allowed to incarcerate families and children, regardless of whether you look at if they've committed like criminal acts, quote unquote, or not? So like that's kind of what it means, like practically when you're organizing. It's like pushing sort of the needle further into, well, why is this happening at all? Like the foundations of and the root causes of, well, we live in a society that allows for mass incarceration. And why is that? It's because, well, for an anarchist, it's the state doesn't have another way to maintain power except to oppress people. And so we incarcerate. We have what is the stat? Like 5% of the world's incarcerated like people are in the U.S. So like the only way that really the U.S. could maintain power, like imagine if all the people in prison were let out right now, like what would happen? Like the government would topple because of the way that these people have been treated in society, and especially like racialized people being treated, black and brown people being imprisoned, because really the way that capitalism works and this like state works is that it can't exist without sort of pushing that violence
Yeah.
on people.
So for you, anarchism is a way of looking more deeply at how people organize themselves, do or don't organize themselves as societies, as groups, as nations, if they have to do it that way.
I guess that's one branch, but yeah, I didn't really come prepared to explain anarchism,
No,
so
I'm sorry. I
I don't have the best response to what is anarchism.
Okay, no, I didn't mean to put you on. I'm actually curious myself.
Yeah.
That's why I asked, because to me it seems a lot like libertarianism, which strikes me as like sort of the conservative version of anarchism, which accepts that there's somebody somewhere is arranging things and making things happen, only it doesn't apply to you because you don't agree with it. That's what libertarianism is. It's like, well, somebody's building roads and, providing hospitals and all those things, but I don't have to follow any rules because I'm a libertarian, And so I've never understood how anarchism isn't just the flip side of that coin. But I do get what you mean as a way of thinking more beyond the frame that we're given. We're given these frames to think in when it comes to like capitalism, like you're pro-capitalism or anti. You don't have to be either. You
don't?
Well, I mean in the sense that you don't have to just like pick one. Somebody's not giving you a choice and say, okay, you're on this side or you're on this side. You can be, well, I'm over here or I'm over here, or I reject all of these things. It's a way of saying I don't
really
take
think
your
you can,
labels.
I mean, yeah, I don't feel like with anarchism it's just like this completely different thing because we still live in the world we live in, right? We can't live outside of capitalism, because it's going to affect every single aspect of our lives. We can't live outside of the state, unless, well, I guess there are some where you're so far removed from acceptability and being acceptable within, let's say, for example, U.S. society, that you may have a little bit more freedom in terms of what you can get away with because you're not really expected to be within that mainstream. But at the same time, the people who are unaccepted by society are also the people who are criminalized. So, for example, there was, I don't know, something similar. A friend of mine did a thesis for LLS, and they did their the Latino Studies presentations this weekend, and I was really impressed by how he talked about, his topic was trans men in Guatemala, and he talked about the way in which trans identity is different in Guatemala than in the U.S. In the U.S., it's very much bio-essentialized and very much the story of trans people is told through this idea of gender dysphoria, of hating your body, of hating yourself, and all this rhetoric is kind of said partly because it's true. It is true. It's a story of some trans people, but it's also a story that kind of is perpetuated because the U.S. sort of the way the health field in the U.S. in terms of trans issues works, or trans identity works, is that you have to repeat the story over and over to psychologists, to doctors, to society in order to be accepted, and to be able to medically transition,
right,
if that's something you're interested. His argument was that I'm saying this, I'm doing it justice, but he said that the way it works is a little bit different in Guatemala because they don't have access to they aren't necessarily required to have those 2 letters from a psychiatrist and that in order to transition, because I believe it's not so much, I guess it's not so streamlined in a sense, and so the way that trans men in Guatemala are relating to their identity isn't necessarily oh, I will be better once I have certain surgeries or something like that. I said, I hope I'm doing it justice, but basically it's this idea of the way that the state sort of is involved and changes the way people of certain identities see even themselves, and how they see themselves based on the experiences that they have with the outside world. And so that was very specific to the health field. But it also is the legitimizing of the state, whether the state recognizes them or not. It's very medicalized in the United States, but it's not necessarily that way in every country. So it was more complex than that, and he did a lot of work, and I want everyone to see his presentation because it was so
Right,
good.
right.
But yeah, so like even in something when people think of like communism or like about communism or like state or whatever, they think of it very much, or like when they think of workers' right, they think very much like unions and like labor and stuff like that. When I think, and also like anarchists, when we think of maybe not all anarchists, but like the anarchists I work with,
Right.
when we think of like laborers, we also think there's the Black Rose chapter in LA is organizing sex workers because it's like sex workers and like people of color, specifically like women of color, or like we're never allowed to join unions anyway, and so where like union labor has so much potential could be like fast food workers and like baristas and things like that that don't traditionally have a path through unionization, through
Right.
through being legitimate, like laborers do, like majority men, like occupied fields or whatever. So that's what I mean. Like sometimes where there has never been granted legitimacy, sometimes there's a lot of potential for sort of organizing, just because people have been pushed so far to like the sideline that they haven't been co-opted in a sense. So like the union, like a lot of unions have been like co-opted and are very liberal, and they work through the state, they work through the legal system through collective bargaining, whereas like before collective bargaining, they like won through striking, through like locking their the bosses out, like through more like radical or like violent or whatever it means. So I don't know, just like the path to like legitimacy is not always, it doesn't always play out the way people think it does in terms of like, well, it's progress, but is it really progress? Like at the labor union, okay, we have unions and now we have collective bargaining, but we're doing it through a means of, we're working through like the legal framework, which we already know the legal, like the system of justice or whatever, quote unquote, is not just, it's racist, it's sexist, it's ableist, it's all these things, right? And so maybe in a space where people haven't been allowed to unionize, they're striking, they're doing like more things that were done in the past before collective bargaining and those kind of things, like sex workers, like baristas and things like that. So I don't know how I got to that point, but
No, that's good. I mean, this is kind of, I should maybe explain to the audience how we came about this particular interview. We were both guests on another radio show recently, and both walked away feeling kind of like the conversation was just guided in a very predictable path, and there was almost no way to answer anything without just going, yes, you're right, this is this way, or no, you're wrong, this is, it was just, we were guided, and that's fine. That's whatever the host, that's how they do their show, and I'm not complaining about anybody, but I did walk away feeling like there's so much more to say and so many different ways to like think about things and describe them. And we talked after the show that we just need more context and more space. So I thought this would be great. We can come here and just do it. So I apologize for bringing up anarchism first.
Never apologize for bringing up anarchism.
Mainly because you weren't prepared to, enlighten me on that. And I'm admitting I know next to nothing about it. My sense from listening to you talk is that kind of what it means is it's sort of a rejection of assumed norms. So there's culture and society, however you want to put it, like assumes certain things about everything. And then what we're given are opportunities to go, oh, I'll go this way or I'll go that way. I will choose one of these preordained paths that society has set out for me. It's like, oh, you're not straight, then you must be gay. Oh, you're not capitalist, you must be a communist, or whatever. It's like they give you options and you're stuck with those options in your life. It's like, well, what do you want to be when you grow up is a question, which means what kind of work do you want to do? How do you want to fit into the capitalist system? And if you say, well, I'm studying, philosophy, they're like, well, how are you going to make money at that? There are all these things that just, it's like, I'm not explaining myself very well, but you're just given choices. And so it's like walking down a hallway with these doors on either side, and you're supposed to just like choose, and each door takes you down another hallway with a set of doors. And so what I was getting from you, long story short,
Smash all the doors.
is that anarchism is saying, I reject all of this. None of it. I don't accept any of these things. There may be a perfectly good reason why someone would go this way, but that's their choice. It's not, you don't get to give me that choice. I get to make that choice for myself. So is that kind of what you mean? It's like,
I think
comes from within?
Yeah. And yeah, one of the people who led me to anarchism is Christina Khan, and she was kind of my introduction to the way anarchism like works within, I guess, I don't know, practical application into like organizing and stuff. Like when you're,
Right.
let's say you're like having an event, like what does that look like to be an anarchist in those spaces or whatever. And I think she said, I think the one time she talked about how it's like anarchism was like a way to fit many worlds in one world. So it's like, it's basically like nothing is going to work the same for a group of people. And that can be for a lot of things. Some of that could be cultural. Some of that could be,
Right.
it could be like so many different things, right? It could just be interest. It could be whatever. And so like something like capitalism or a state, like it doesn't allow you to exist in a way. Like, for example, like all the communities who were trying to get what is it, like fiber optic internet or whatever, and all the laws that were passed, so they couldn't get it, even though they
Right.
were using all their money, all their resources, their own community.
Sure.
They decided to do something right, but why? Because it wasn't profitable to certain people.
Exactly.
And the state, like the in the same, like the smaller town or this I forgot what state it was in, wanted that control, right, and to profit off of it. And so this idea of like under like anarchism, like little towns and little pockets or whatever could do whatever they wanted as long as it wasn't like hurting and infringing upon other people's rights. And so it's this idea that like there should be many worlds within the world, and not this like idea of trying to make something streamlined. The other thing with like anarchism, people say like, oh well, what are you going to do when like all the prisons are gone and blah blah blah, all these, what are you going to do with no government? Like there isn't, like, first of all, like this isn't even our land to say what should and shouldn't happen on it. So it's also just like giving people direct say in how they want things to work. So for me, anarchism is like a lot of like admin and like clerical work. It's like, okay, we gotta like, well, what do these people want? What do these people want? And kind of like try to make everyone's voice heard and like actually figure out how to apply it. More so than like smashing windows and like throwing Molotov cocktails, which has its time and its place, but like I think a lot of people get confused. So like anarchism, if you've seen the symbol, right, it's the A inside like a circle,
Right.
inside a circle.
Yeah.
It's from what I've heard, it's like anarchism, order in anarchism, just because people are allowed to sort of they have the freedom to do things that they want, but in like an organized way. So that's what I mean with like there's so many like spreadsheets that happen and so many like, I don't know, like Google Docs and all these different things to try to make order out of what people want. So like prioritizing society based on what people need. Like there's like, for me, there's no reason why healthcare isn't free, housing isn't free, education isn't free. Like we have more than enough resources in the world to do it. If it wasn't for rich people hoarding and like hoarding all these resources, then all of these things would be super feasible if we decided to have a society based on providing people what they needed and like maximizing happiness. But that's not what society is based off of, which is why we have what we currently have.
Yes,
So
that is true. Well, one thing that's fascinating me that you just sort of brought up is how modern market-oriented. I will eschew capitalism for the moment and just kind of broaden that out, because that is one way of doing market-based. You know, you work for a living, basically. You work for somebody else and you get paid. That is capitalist, but that's also other things too. There are other things that do that. So I just think it's really interesting the way they co-opted sort of the original ideas that existed when people were hunter-gatherers, which was, you know, you were in charge of your own fate, basically. If you wanted to just like lay around all the time and do nothing, then you also wouldn't eat, because you're not growing food and you're not hunting food. And so, you know, unless somebody took pity on you and gave you food, you're not going to eat, or you're not going to have shelter. So you had to work to produce the things that you needed in life, right? I mean, that's just basically a hunter-gatherer's thing, is like, I have to gather or I have to hunt in order to have food, in order to have shelter. So they co-opted this idea of you must work, and the amount of energy you put in is equal to the amount of rewards you get, which can be true if you're building huts out of grass and hunting berries and rabbits, for dinner. Yeah, the person with more energy and who really puts a lot of time in it is going to have a nicer setup than the person who's just kind of lackadaisical and like, oh, I'm just going to sit here and take a nap for half the day. And they created a society where now I have money, and if you want money, you must have money in order to buy things. So if you want money, you have to work for me. And so I tell you, all those same things that were true about life in the hunter-gatherer days. Well, if you want to work hard, you want to do all these things. But it's not true in this system. The harder you work doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to pay you more. In fact, many, if not most of the hardest jobs are the lowest paying.
Yep.
That's why nobody wants to do them. So it's like, it's turned around, and what they're saying about work is true in an ideal sense, but not true in this setting that's being applied in. And that's neither here nor there. But that just, it struck me as like how clever some of these people are at kind of making their idea seem right. Like it seems right.
I mean, people will bend backwards all kinds of ways to try to justify whatever it is that they're selling. And so, I mean, I don't think it's that like the mental acrobatics or like the logical acrobatics that some people have. It's like kind of hard to believe. So like you'll have like the alt-right that will say like will be like full of like anti-Semitic be like anti-Semitic and full of people who are like outright anti-Semitic and will say they anti-Semitic, but then also align themselves with people who will say Palestinian liberation is anti-Semitic and we're here to like defend Jewish people, right? But like you hold both of those things are true. They are organized, like they are working with anti-Semitic people, and they're working with Israel and saying the Palestinian people are anti-Semitic, but they really don't care about anti-Semitism. They care about maintaining state power in Israel and also like oppressing Palestinian people, right? And so that's one, like, that's why I'm like, it sometimes the logical argument, so like, sometimes like convincing hearts and minds in that sense doesn't work. I think certain people can't be convinced because they don't want to be convinced. And so that's just like one example of that. But then when it comes to like hunter-gatherer type ideas, I think, first of all, like people like to, it's really weird. And I think it makes complete sense how like people who are very, very pro-capitalist and very, I mean, before there was capitalism, there was like feudalism and all these other like hierarchical powers, right? But people who will make this argument like very pro-capitalism also a lot of times happen to be very white supremacist, and will also continue these like ableist arguments of, well, if you can't put in the work, then you like don't deserve to eat, for example, which doesn't even apply because humans have always been aggressively social and have always like built community with each other, whether they were like whether they stayed in one place or whether they like traveled around or like migrated from like seasons or whatever. So first of all, like that doesn't even make sense if you look at history. And they also will use the argument of like survival of the fittest, which was not the argument that Darwin ever put out. It was never about the strongest survives. It's the most adaptable survives. And a lot of times the most adaptable is people who work together, which is very anarchism, like mutual aid and helping each other. I mean, that's just, but anyway, people will use whatever arguments they want to justify whatever they're interested in justifying. And so when it comes to the way that people say capitalism is just human nature, it's not. For me, when I think of human nature, isn't the nature of like being egotistical and selfish. Like that's not in my nature. That's not what I grew up on. What I grew up on was people supporting each other no matter what. It was people caring for each other in very complicated and complex ways. And I also heard another argument in terms of like gender-based like arguments in terms of like, the Stanford prison experiment. That I heard people making that argument about comparing like the prison Stanford experiment with the way that people justify capitalism, which is like this whole idea of like it being innate human nature to like be violent towards other people in like submissive positions to you, like for the you know what I mean, like the Stanford prison, like there were the prison guards and then there were like the prisoners, and how people say, oh, it's human nature, like if you have power you are gonna abuse it, but they don't consider the fact that it was like white males in their 20s who were the one doing that. Like it's like white males in their 20s, especially like privileged college educated kids, are not, or men are not the like neutral ground that people claim they are. Like they have their own things, and they also grew up in a society privileged, being white, being men, being college educated, probably wealthy-ish. So that is not like, that's not representative of me, that's not representative of the vast majority of the world, especially at that time.
Right.
So like this whole idea of like people justify the like most selfish and violent acts that people do, like the prison guards at the like the students who played the role of prison guards,
Right.
how evil they were towards other people, as like, oh, that's just what human nature is. But that's not necessarily what human nature is. That is a very specific sample of humanity. And so whatever that means, whether that does apply to other people or not, like just claiming that it is representative kind of shows like how people or like how people making the argument don't consider like the history of individuals and like their background as like varying factors, because you can't like compare, like if you I'm not saying it would be different, but you can't just assume that it's going to be the same. Like that was a very specific demographic. And so with capitalism, people say the same thing, like, oh, all the selfishness and the greed, like that's just human nature. But that's not necessarily the case. You might be confusing the human nature of like these white wealthy or like white privileged men in their 20s with the rest of humanity. Like that's not necessarily the case. And that was a very specific setting. I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but it's very much, I don't know, just like these different ways of looking at it that brings in the way in which like people have been like racialized and like gendered, kind of changes the way we interact with society and how society treats them. So like my default isn't to hurt people, it's to help people, because I've been through a lot of different things and like gone through a lot of different things that I don't want that towards other people. And I would, like, if I was giving a position of power, which I never have, not really, I couldn't imagine doing something bad, or couldn't like imagine hurting someone else for the sake of myself. So like I don't see how that's representative of really the rest of humanity, because that's, again, even just and take anyone in the US, that still wouldn't be representative of the rest of like the world.
Right.
So even just that small sampling, in what way does that show human nature? Because that's a very specific culture. And
true.
Yeah.
But I can also offer another alternative to that. So here, let's consider human nature in this sense. We naturally, as animals, tend to express anger, or when we are violent, it is based on fear usually. So if I were afraid of you, then I'd be like, like we kill spiders, or we kill things that we're afraid of, So in that sense, if you make somebody a prison guard and then you have prisoners, well, obviously you are oppressing these people. You are in charge of containing them and keeping them from doing what they want to do. And so I would think you would naturally be afraid of them, in which case that might tend to bring out that kind of action, not because people are inherently cruel, but